Well, Tony and I are going to tag team on this a little bit, and I just want to kind of give you all a sense of where we are considering going with our regulatory revisions. Next slide. Going to just kind of recap what kind of drove us and got us to this point in the first place, and then some of the things that we have done already. And then many of you have already been involved in providing us some feedback on the impact of the rules. We want to talk a little bit about what we're considering. Since this is not the rule release party, we won't do an in-depth dive, but we certainly want to give you kind of a sense of kind of where things are going and how the process works. Next slide. So this is a very busy slide, but essentially the Federal Advisor Committee that was convened several years ago gave OPM a set of marching orders, if you will. It's all contained in the CFC report. Now, I believe these slides are going to be available to you following this presentation. So if you hover over the CFC report, you'll get a link that will allow you to go directly to the report. And you can see exactly what recommendations were made to OPM. And it won't give you what we did with that recommendation, but suffice it to say that we did implement the majority of these particular findings from the CFC 50 Commission. It has taken some time, as everything does in the government, but I would dare to say that our ability to get rules published and implemented were probably far faster than some other rules that I've seen sort of languish at OMB. Next slide. We actually took to heart to implement those findings. And again, on this slide, if you hover over the highlighted areas, you will be able to see when you click on it, it'll actually take you to the CFC final rule and the executive order that was actually executed by President Obama to allow us to move forward with a lot of the sort of game-changing things that we can do now, including offering the opportunity to givers to give through retirees and to execute a volunteer program. So those were two of the biggest items in that release. The OMB also had required us to collect data over 3 campaigns and reassess the impact that these rules made to the CFC. So we're actually in that stage now where we have finally collected enough data and enough input to be able to consider some changes to the rules as it relates to those earlier changes in 2014. Next slide. As I mentioned, we have been working and trying to hear from LFCC members, campaign managers, and charities on things that we should consider reassessing as it relates to the impact that the rules had on the program. Now, I will also say that we have also collected some internal intelligence of our own to also include in this regulatory review and what I would consider technical corrections to the rules. And Tony is going to talk a little bit about what we're considering as it relates to the rules that affect charities, the rules that affect donors, the rules that affect the governance structure or the LFCCs, and some other provisions that we're considering. But again, this is a high-level conversation. This is in no way going to inform us specifically, inform you on what is actually going to go in the package to be released. But I believe that, again, kudos to a lot of you who have given us some input we definitely want you to see that your work has not been in vain, and it is going towards what I believe is going to be a good package that we send over to OMB for publication. Next slide. Tony, do you want to give the highlights here?
Sure, thanks, Keith. Several of the areas that we're going to touch on first today are a lot of the rules that affect charities and federations. So the CFC rules currently have dollar thresholds for when we require audited financial statements. Those thresholds haven't really been changed since probably the 1990s. And so what we're looking at doing is updating those thresholds. We've been looking at what do states and other programs have for when audited financial statements are required. And then once we update the thresholds, then indexing them, say, for example, to CPI or some other government index, so that we don't have to wait 10 years for the CFC rules to be changed in order to keep that audit threshold at a reasonable level. In 2017, the new rules did add some burden on federations to report their cost information to OPM on a monthly basis. We're looking at how we can include that information once a year in a federation application and remove a monthly reporting requirement that is burdensome, and not only is it hard for the federations to meet, it's hard for us to track it with the small team we've got. We do want to make sure that the CFC rules then also follow IRS requirements, especially as they, revolve around religious organizations, where they're, where a church or other kind of religious organization may have various social service programs around the country. We want to make sure that we are aligned with what the IRS requires for organizations reporting of chapters, affiliates, parents, and subs. And then also our rules in the CFC for what are currently called family support and youth programs also are one of the areas that probably haven't been changed since the 1990s. So we've done some conversations with DOD because there are welfare and relief programs on military bases and installations around the world. So we want to make sure that the CFC rules are in agreement with the DOD requirements for those programs so that we can increase the participation of programs like that in CFC. Next slide, Elizabeth. Also, as we've seen the charity list go from 24,000 to 5,000, we have a national/international section, and we have an international section. And as the numbers have come down, we're looking at just merging the two sections together. It wouldn't change the rules for international charities. You would still need to substantiate a presence in one foreign country for your services, but it would eliminate a very small section in the CFC online listing. We want to align our rules with the business practices for online and web-based services and look at, are there ways of expanding charitable eligibility? There are currently some IRS codes, and don't ask me to, I've talked to people. There are C19 and C23 organizations in the IRS that serve veterans, and those are very popular causes for us. So in addition to 501c3 organizations, we've had discussions about expanding the charity eligibility there. And also, there are a lot of Native American organizations that are, qualify as nonprofits under separate codes, and looking at, being more inclusive of those organizations is another possibility. Next slide. And then the last slide here on charities, we have a lot of situations where charities go out of business. And when they cease operations, or when they merge, or when they lose their IRS status, we have some business practices that we've worked out with OPM General Counsel and the CCA about what happens when those charities go out of business. So we want to get those put into our regulations. We communicate that when the problems arise. And then finally, we also want to align our rules with the IRS requirements for national organizations with chapters and affiliates. So this wouldn't change the single listing rule we've got for national organizations, but it would recognize that there's a lot of mergers going on these days, and we want to make sure that we're, providing listings to organizations as they are granted status with the IRS, whether that changes or not. And we'd certainly still keep the pro forma for some of those chapters and affiliates that might not be filing their own Form 990. Next slide. Okay. Now, there's a few things that have been brought to our attention and that we're looking at doing that would affect donors. And as Keith referenced earlier, some of the rules for giving volunteer time and for retiree giving out of their annuity come out of an executive order that is separate from the CFC regulations at 5 CFR 950. So we want to take the things that are in the executive order and duplicate those authorities in the rules. And then recognizing that retirees are the fastest growing segment of the campaign, there are a couple of other ways we want to be able to allow those retirees to give. We actually still are already doing some test cases with retirees who want to include CFC charities with their required minimum distributions. So as your hair gets whiter, you'll understand what that is, but retirees who have amassed some savings are required to take distributions out of it, and making sure they can put some of that to charitable purposes is one additional source. And then for people who have an IRA, giving a qualified charitable transfer from those retirement accounts would be another way to fund CFC giving. Now, throughout the pandemic, the government still tried to keep Feds Feed Families and other in-kind giving programs working, but it's hard. It's hard when you have a box at the front door of your agency and nobody's coming through the front door to put cans of soup or chili or something in it. So we want to look at how we can improve our interaction with Feds Feed Families and other online giving programs. We often talk about the CFC as being one of the federal benefit programs. If you're a federal employee listening to this, you know that you have automatic renewals and things like your TSP account, things like your healthcare and your vision and dental. So unless you want to make changes in open season, those roll forward. So how can we make automatic renewals also a possibility in CFC? And as Keith referenced, the special solicitations, in the last 6 years, we've had 3. And, if you're living in Dallas or Phoenix and you're under a heat dome right now, climate related and other disasters are not going away. So we want to look at how can we impose some provisions that allow us to open up special solicitations in terms of a disaster much faster than we have been able to do. Put in some, switches that when certain things happen, we can automatically start raising money for disaster. And when we've had those, people who are already making an allotment haven't been able to make any additional spend if they wanted to add a gift for a hurricane or a tornado or a wildfire. So we want to explore with the payroll offices, could that be a possibility? Now that we're in an electronic environment, a lot of those data and electrons move back and forth through very secure platforms. So making a change hopefully would be fairly simple. Next slide, Elizabeth. And then finally, we're also looking at what we can do as far as governance. In many markets where there are federal executive boards, there's going to be some changes in how those boards are being run. So as those changes occur, we want to look at how can the CFC be better aligned with the new face of federal executive boards. So we'll be working with the team at OPM who coordinate those FEBs, and certainly briefing the LFCC members as we get into August and look ahead. But many of those FEB staff people have become OPM employees over the last few pay periods. Once we allowed retirees to give to CFC more elaborately, many people want to serve on the LFCC. So we want to codify the ability of retirees to be on those committees. And we also want to adjust the leadership terms. We may have been a little tight in 2017 at term limits for LFCC chairs, but people who are very attuned to and leaders of the CFC, we want to keep them engaged and look at reasonable term limits and succession plans for LFCC chairs that aren't too short. And a lot of our rules do require certain training, but they were written before a lot of training was done online, and they were written before we actually knew how the LFCCs would interact with OPM's procurement office on selecting outreach coordinators. So we just need to make sure that our rules reflect our practices and reflect what's being done, because I would say in 2017 was still somewhat hypothetical about how that was going to work, and we now have more experience in that. And I think we have one last list here, Elizabeth. And then finally, again, a lot of the rules required printing pledge forms, printing charity lists, and they set deadlines. We're only going to print these for X number of years. There's very specific references in the rules. So we just want to go through and update those things where there are dates in that are, look back to 2014. And 10 years later, we want to be able to make sure that those technical provisions are corrected and easily understood in 2024 as they might have been in 2014. So there's a lot under consideration, but Keith, you want to talk a little bit about the next steps from here?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. You could advance to the last slide. Again, forgive me if I freeze up. Not always comfortable with this particular connection here, where I'm remotely broadcasting from. But I'll quickly go through this so we can answer any questions we can. Ordinarily, the draft rules undergo our OPM internal clearance process, and before it's advanced to O&B. So that's where we are now. As Tony mentioned, these are proposed things. They could get modified as they go through our legal department and we are asked questions about their impact. But once we get a final package, we'll send those to O&B. Then O&B will direct an intragovernmental clearance process. That is not an OPM process. What it allows is sort of for the agencies to kick the tires on the actual provisions to see what might impact another agency. Another agency may have a set of rules that's also in the clearance process that we're not familiar with, so they can sort of do that fact checking. It's still not clear to me if it's a sequential process by which the intergovernmental process will kick off, and then when it's finished, then it'll go to the public. It could be simultaneous. Not clear to me there. But once the revised rules are in final draft, they are published in the Federal Register for public comment. Now, if any of you remember when we first did this to modify the rules, there was a little bit of a challenge because it got out to the public before it actually hit the Federal Register. So I was being asked questions about rules that the public wasn't even aware of, so at least in my view. So it was an interesting time, but we got through it, and here we are now making changes to those. So once they are out for public comment, we will have there will be a defined period of time that those questions and comments are sent in, and then OPM will respond to those comments and consider an additional revision if necessary. We anticipate that we would get a lot of public comments again, but hopefully, again, because these are rule changes that we expect to improve the program, I just don't know what kind of volume we'll get, but we'll deal with that when it comes. Once we have considered those final comments in revamping the rules themselves, then we will push it out back through OMB for a final rule publication in the Federal Register with an implementation date. So that kind of follows how this process worked the last time. But I'm sure every administration has some creative license on how they would like that done. And Congress can also weigh in on the amount of public rules that are released to the public. If they feel that there's a growing amount of rules and regulations around an industry's practices, they may make some modifications or weigh in. I don't expect that to be the case here, but they can certainly have staff members that are very interested in the CFC program and certainly can get involved in this public comment and review process. So that's kind of how I expect the rule change process to work. But again, I'm always ready to stand by if there's any variation on these sort of 5 steps, as I understand it. With that, I'm going to end here and again, just kind of open up if there are any questions that we can answer at this point regarding the rules and the CFC impact assessment that we have so far.
Keith, we did not get any big questions in the chat other than, one person just asking, are these the actual rules or not? And I think you've answered that in what's next slide.
Yeah, those are things that we're considering. This is not a release party, as I mentioned, but I just wanted you all to know that your input on this process very, very much appreciated. We certainly have our own internal things that we believe we needed to make technical corrections to address, but your impact, the CFC National Committee and your volunteers have been very helpful in sort of giving us the guiding light on what we should be focused on. So for that, I thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Keith. I think we're already practically at 3 o'clock. So, unfortunately, we're not giving folks a break like you did 2 weeks ago, Elizabeth and Curtis, to take care of their biology. But if you need a break, just take it. We will be posting.
I saw one hand up, Tony, but I
okay.
could see things.
Teddy, it is Curtis. So I had a couple things I wanted to say. First off, thank you to you guys. You were very good with reaching out to the local federal coordinating committees and really, fleshing all of this out in advance, which makes a huge difference. And then the other thing is, it's so nice to hear about the change to the audit requirements for charities, as you talked about the cascading effect earlier. This is certainly going to help us address that. And you also heard, the gentleman from the Garden Empire talking about local charities and importance. So retaining those is going to be very helpful. The one question I do have is, with the inclusion of C19s and C23s, would they have the same requirements of the 501c3s, or would it be more like the family support and youth programs?
Probably the same as 501c3s, because they are recognized in the IRS tax code, whereas the MWR programs are recognized in DoD policy. So the other veterans groups are actually tax categories.
That's correct.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure.
And there was another question, will these be open for public comment? Absolutely. So right now, we actually don't have a narrative draft of rules. When there is a narrative draft that people can actually read, they will be open for public comment. And I would say that the rules changes in 2014 that were implemented in 2017 were a sea change for the CFC. I think these are going to be a technical correction. These, I mean, we certainly expect comments. We might not expect the thousands of comments that came in 12 years ago.
That's not to say there's lack of interest. I just think that having been under these rules for several years, there won't be the mystery of their impact, their reach, so forth and so on. Now, again, I can be surprised. Yeah, I generally am in government in Washington, but that's not what we're thinking right now. We're assuming that this will be a little bit of a faster turnaround. Not to say that we won't get some good quality comments for us to consider as we go through this process.
And there's also a question from Carrie Jasper. Is there any rule change under consideration that would impact how often charities apply and how they apply?
Right now, there aren't any rules under consideration that would impact the frequency. And I'll just say one of the reasons why is that the economics of every organization can change on a dime. And so I think donors expect us to be able to have a point in time on an organization's financial viability, as well as their status with the IRS. And so the IRS Form 990 or an equivalent is a very good tool to make sure that we have with an application to point to its governance structure and to its costs. And also the financial statement audit is also a good tool on a going concern issue that an organization may or may not experience economically. Now, again, because we're considering raising the threshold, there will be many that will fall below, and that's our expectation, that we will have a better scenario for organizations who find an audit or review very costly because it's not cheap, but still have enough confidence in the organizations that are submitting the data that they're quality organizations from that standpoint.
And Keith, a question from Chris Merlo, one of the LFCC members, is any idea how long this process takes? I mean, other than to say there's a 30-day comment period and a 60-day comment period, the land between those is fungible.
Yeah. I have a lot of friends who are lawyers. And so if I went to any one of them and asked them how long a rule change lasts or the process, I think they'd all give me a different answer. So I don't think it would be very smart of me to try to guess how long that process will take, because it does involve legal teams on both sides, OPM and OMB. But I believe that the energy that we have to make sure that we have a program that is up to date, and the fact that we are asked by OMB to do this assessment allows us the opportunity to get in there and to, show them that we have, we're serious about making sure that we are keeping up with the times with this program. I think it will be well received. Now, some of the provisions they may not understand, so we may have to spend some time with them going over our data and explaining to them how we arrived at this particular proposal versus something else. So that can be time consuming, but it wouldn't be prudent for me to give you, 6 months, 9 months, a year, how long that would take. I just don't know.
Okay. And just trying to see if there was anything else here.
Well, I certainly don't want to take any more of your time, Tony, to talk about the ethics part of this. Unfortunately for me, I'm going to have to jump off, but I certainly welcome any questions and any other input that comes our way, and we will try to turn those answers around as quickly as we can. So thanks, everybody. Great seeing you, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Okay, and enjoy yours, Keith.
Thank you.
Thank you, Keith.